morning, brothers, professors. Welcome to the 2023 Capstone Academy. Just wanted to say a few words of introduction. As you know, I'm Dr. Kearns. What is a capstone? Well, in architecture, a capstone is something that's placed at the highest point on a given column or an edifice of some kind. It's also called in English a coping stone. It's decorative in a way, but also indicates the highest point of the building or of the edifice in some way. In English in the US especially, it means something like the highest place reached in a person's career, or the highest form of achievement that they've been able to reach, I suppose. And so I think there's a good analogy for what we're doing here. What the brothers are going to be presenting is a short version of what they've been working on in their capstone paper, and a version that's aimed particularly at you as an audience, at all of us, at helping us to see what it was in their presentation that both got them interested and excited about learning it, and also the value of it for the wider world. These presentations are aimed at excellence, and they're aimed at showing us what the brothers have been able to achieve at their highest level. Bearing that in mind, I think it's important just to take a step back at various points in the presentation and reflect on how many of the different subjects will be related together. That's one of our primary concerns here in the College of Humanities, is to show how different things relate to one another, especially in the realm of the human, if you will, so art, literature, and music. And that's something that I hope the presentations themselves help us to do, to make those connections between the different things, although the presentations won't actively do that. That's not their main goal, but it's hoped that they'll be able to kind of reveal something that we can take away. And so something that will lead us to ask further questions. And especially, of course, is for the sake of the first-year brothers who will be doing this themselves next year. Asking questions, seeking for truth wherever it may be found. Oops. Somehow my mic went off. And when finding it, we do so excellence. Well, so we'll begin with the first. Thank you.
Mercy in the Lord of the Rings. Why mercy and why the Lord of the Rings? You may be thinking, of course, what else should Brother Miguel write his capstone about? But that is not the right question. The right question is, what else should anybody write his capstone about? And I think that answers the first question, or the second one. The other question about mercy. I realized that in the 20th century, there is a great need for mercy. All these wars, all these different calamities that happen to humanity, and also the revelation of the divine mercy by St. Faustina Kowalska. Tolkien lived during this time, and he expressed in his literature the highest form of this virtue. It is a pivotal virtue in his novel Mercy. You see how Gollum, the vile creature, who many times deserves death and is spared, ends up being the key to the salvation and the resolution of the story. I want to share with you some characteristics of mercy that I have found during my study. First of all is that in Tolkien, mercy is not related to God, as is for us. Usually we tend to think we are merciful because God has been merciful to us. For Tolkien, in his pre-redemption legend, he thinks of it in a different way, closer to Aristotle. For Aristotle, it is a question of being close to the person who's suffering an evil. And this is the case of Frodo and Gollum. Frodo is close to Gollum because he's suffering from the same thing. He sees the corruption that the ring has provoked on Gollum, and he fears that that might be also his case. And so he is able to have mercy in Gollum. And finally, another characteristic of mercy is that it is contrary to prudence. And Gandalf states this many times. It is not a do des. It's not, I'm going to be merciful to Gollum so that in the end the quest might be fulfilled. It is, I'm going to be merciful to Gollum even though that might be dangerous for me. And in the end, I hope that I will be rewarded in some special way. And as a conclusion for my work, I only want to share with you this sentence. And I want to remember you that inside every person, somewhere inside the bitterest of the persons, you can always find, as in the case of Gollum, an old and weary hobbit.
The Great War and the Death of God. Now, imagine with me for a moment, if you will, that you are living in the most beautiful summer you have ever experienced. In fact, it's the most beautiful summer that anyone in living memory has experienced. Maybe you're in Europe, and you're out in the Swiss Alps in a beautiful little cottage with the rolling green valleys and the little sheep. Or maybe you're enjoying the lush countryside of France, with a tea on the bank of the Seine River. And you open up your newspaper, flip it open, and you read there that some foreign heir apparent was just shot in Serbia. You close your newspaper, and you turn to your wife and you say, "Honey, don't worry. Europe won't go to war. After all, we live in an enlightened world with science and progress. And the European powers, they know that if we were to go to war, well, we'd undermine civilization itself." But then, 10 days later, you find yourself buttoning up your military uniform, putting on your pit helmet, grabbing your rifle, and marching off to the front lines of the most destructive war humanity had yet seen. A war which quickly turned into a meat grinder, where generals literally sent soldiers out to stop machine gun fire with their chests. And after World War I, World War II, the Nazi concentration camps, the Gulag, the start of communism, the spread of death and destruction around the world, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and today, Ukraine. Or think of the cultural upheaval of the 20th century, the sexual revolution, the emptying out of churches, the loss of vocations. What happened? Well, a man by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he was a survivor of the Russian Gulag and a commentator on events of the 20th century. He argued that what started in the Great War and carried on to the 20th century happened because man forgot God. Now, don't get me wrong, but I don't see it. Like, how did we go from just setting God aside in the Enlightenment to mustard gas, landmines, trench warfare in the First World War? So, in writing my capstone, I sought to find the answer to this. And I believe the answer lies in the thought of a German writer, a mystic, some would even call him. You see, I believe, as does Friedrich Nietzsche, that what happened in the Great War in the following century did not happen because man simply forgot God. No, no, no. No, as Zarathustra, Nietzsche's literary character, runs through the streets proclaiming like a madman, God is dead, and we have killed him. Doing so, man killed himself.
The pursuit of love as reflected in two authors of Romanticism. Dear fathers, brothers, professors, what are we doing studying humanities? Exploring monsters, aren't we? Well, a friend of mine declared in his encyclical letter, Redemptor Hominis, that man cannot live without love. Indeed, we all want to love and be loved, but this remains too abstract an idea to pigeonhole. We cannot define love, but we all talk about it. That's why I wanted to focus on a period in which the writings are highly autobiographical, because in the end, the characters of these novels are not fictional, since it is the drama combined with the author's experiences. A period where the deepest feelings of the human heart are portrayed could offer authentic individual experiences about love. Besides, the Romantic period delights us with fascinating features. First, brothers, wait for it. The exaltation of feeling, the constant use of imagination, irrationality, idealism, political and philosophical concerns, among others. Now, when it comes to love, there is an issue. These authors were seeking the same thing, but they took different routes. It sounds like something we are living in current times. We are all looking for the same thing. We are want to fulfill our deepest desires, but sometimes we take different paths. However, these authors knew what they wanted. And if you want to know if Alessandro Manzoni and Johann von Goethe fulfilled their desires, you should go and read my capstone.
An identity journey, self-expression in Van Gogh's self-portraits. One day, during adoration, I realized, and I was amazed, by how much we can be transformed by the things we contemplate, for the good and for the bad. During this same time of the year, I was reading Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, a story where we meet Dorian and his picture, a cursed portrait that reflected the corruption of Dorian's soul. It was a great story, an amazing book, but in the end, it was just a story of an artist, a portrait, and a tragedy. An artist, a portrait, and a tragedy. Actually, that sounded very familiar to me. In fact, what I was remembering, it was not just any fictional story, but it was the story of a so-called math artist, one of the most famous and enigmatic modern artists of our days. The story, the depiction of his self-portraiture, a collection of more than 35 self-portraits during a span of 10 years, and a story of his own tragedy, a story of a misunderstood and miscarried illness and suicide. In that moment, I realized that I wanted to write about Vincent van Gogh. But who was this man? Who did he say he was? I didn't know. But he left as a legacy more than 2,000 artworks, which included his collection of self-portraits, the second biggest collection just after Rembrandt's. So I decided that I wanted to immerse myself in this adventure, in Vincent's identity journey. How am I supposed to do this? Well, I decided to follow all his paintings, especially his self-portraits, immerse myself in the experience of not just seeing details of a picture, but actually experience, like Vincent wanted, to see him face to face, eyes to eyes. Now, in our modern times, we see that it's not just enough a technique. Art is more than just good conventions, traditions, but art is a medium to express one's own subjectivity and share that to the world. But well, at the end, that could be just my interpretation. That's the reason I decided to connect this with the archive of more than 900 letters Van Gogh left. Most of them wrote to his brother Theo Van Gogh. There he shared everything. The way he experienced life, the way he experienced relationship with the people he loved, his own traumas. He just opened his heart to his brother. And by doing so, he left us an amazing, a revealing legacy of intimacy with oneself. As an outcome, we reach to a deep reflection on the significance of answering to the question, who am I? Nevertheless, this is just one first step that aims to give an answer to an even more fundamental question, that is to ask God, who do you say I am?
Hester and Lizzie, assertive women of their time. Brothers, before starting this presentation, I would like to ask you two questions. Which is the first thought that comes to you when you listen to the word feminism? Or which is the first thing that you think about when you listen to the term individualism? It can be so normal that we, as Catholic seminarians, when we listen to these terms, we can immediately get very defensive and immediately start thinking for arguments in order to argue against these ideas. But I would like to say as Pascal, that no error attracts but for a part of truth that it contains. And that is why in my capstone, by comparing two emblematic characters of classic literature, or works of classic literature, such as The Scarlet Letter and Pride and Prejudice, I will talk about feminism. I will talk about individualism, but not to rail against these ideas. Instead of that, I will give them the reason by seeking the part of truth which they contain. During this whole process, I have been learning many things. One of them is just to realize how inspirational these two characters can be for women nowadays, or how, not through violence, riots, or protest, but through love, are able to be assertive in their femininity and to really change culture. But above all, what helped me as humanist, and can help you as humanist that you are, is to broaden my horizons and to really think out of the box, to be more available, to listen and understand what women, through protest, through violence, through riots, through feminism, through individualism, are really looking for. This is something that can help us all to be more able to listen, to understand, and to help better the society in which we live on.
The relationship between Mozart and his father in Lacrimosa. Everyone here in this auditorium knows who is the best musician ever. Of course, we think of Mozart, a child prodigy, who at the age of 4, he learned how to play piano. At the age of 5, he composed his first musical works. And at the age of 6, he was already giving concerts in the entire Europe. But that doesn't mean he suffered much. This capstone is an analysis of the toxic relationship between Mozart and his father. One of his works, musical works, that shows this relationship is the Lacrimosa from the Requiem Mass, which he only composed the first 8 measures before he died. Lacrimosa dies illa. Full of tears shall be the day, qua resurget ex favilla, when from the ashes shall arise, iundicamus homo reus, the guilty man to be judged. Keep this in mind, brothers. The guilty man Who was the guilty man in Mozart's life? Two options. Mozart himself or Leopold Mozart, his father.
Stock markets and their effects on economic growth. So I didn't write a capstone because I had already written longer research papers during my time in university. So Father Miguel asked me to present one of these in this event. So during this seminar that I took on economics and economic growth, I analyzed the relationship that the stock market had with economic growth. Does having a stock market in the economy help the economy grow? Does it deter from the economy? But before even getting into that, I have to talk about what a stock market is. Probably all of you have heard the term stock market. You have heard that the stocks go up or down, that the market crashes. But what is it? So it's composed of two words, stock and market. I think all of us have had experience of what a market is. We go to a supermarket. It's a place where we can buy things. We can buy, for example, food. So a market is a place where you can buy or sell goods or services. That's the market. But what is a stock? So a stock is a share, is a percentage of the company. Imagine I put a lemonade stand and I start selling lemonade. I want to increase and grow. And I bring on investors and I ask them for money. That would mean that I give them a share of the company, a stock. They have a percentage of the company. They give me money and we can grow together. In the stock market, what happens is that there are many shares that are being bought or sold in the market. So I can buy right now, if I would have money, an Apple stock, and that I would have to pay $170 for a very small percentage of Apple. So I would be owning Apple. Okay, so this is the stock market. In my paper, I looked at the relationship, this relationship, and I found that the stock market helps, in general, economic growth. There are some negative aspects of the stock market. For example, that it is prone to bubbles and crashes. So people start to invest in the market just because of fashion, just because it's attractive. And when it becomes attached to the actual value of the thing you are buying, you can be just going for the fashion and then it crashes, and that's a problem for the economy. But in general, the stock market provides liquidity. That means that you can enter and go out quickly. So that means if a person can put his money in, he can take it out. So that makes it more attractive for people to invest. Another reason why a stock market can help economic growth is because you can tie manager compensation with the market. And that means that if the manager, the person who administers the company, gets stock as a reward, that means that if he does good, he will be winning more. There are other reasons why this relationship helps the economy grow, but the conclusion for my paper was that yes, it helps, although there are some problems like bubbles and crashes. Thank you.
The future of God, humanities, and society. Brothers, how do you think will be society in the future? Like, will God still exist in that society? How will be art? Like, seeing nowadays that so-called art, how will be in the future? Those are the questions I try to answer, taking into account two novels from the 20th century. The Glassbead Game by Hermann Hesse and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Those two novels are kind of important, but mainly they are very opposite. Both of them propose a society which is divided. But while Hermann Hesse's
the glassbead game divides the society into academic, intellectual society, and normal society. Brave New World divides the society into the savage lands, where non-civilized people lives, and the world state, where all the society is organized and conditioned to be happy. God, for one, God for Hermann Hesse, will be the highest point of alignment, the knowledge, the self-discover. God for Aldous Huxley will be happiness, the pursuit of happiness, even with drugs and whatever you need to feel good. Art for Hermann Hesse in the Glassbead game will be the highest form of self-expression, and for Aldous Huxley will be something against the state, something banned. These two societies, well, are kind of different, but they are complementary. At the end of my capstone, you should read it, you will realize a society without God, a society without art, without humanities, it is not enough for humans.
The influence of nature in the sorrows of young Werther. How do you feel spring when all the trees and flowers are blossoming? During summer, when the sun is burning your skin. During fall, when all the trees, all the leaves are falling down. Or during winter, when everything is cold and dark. Nature has been a recurring theme in literature and music throughout history. It symbolized beauty, harmony, tranquility, and a reflection of the human condition. After changing 3 times of topic, I decided to write a capstone about nature because I realized that it has a strong influence in us as human beings. During my 3rd semester, I started reading The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And I was amazed how Werther, the main character, during summer, he was so active and tired at the same time. How during spring, he falls in love with Charlotte, or Lot, as he would say. Or during the dark, angelic winter, when he commits suicide. Later on, I studied Vivaldi's concerto. I was amazed how the violins depict the chirping of birds in spring, a persecution during fall, or ice breaking in winter. I also found a magnificent poem that goes along with this magnificent violins concerto. And I was wondering how this poem can depict the scenes that the violins are playing. If you want to know nature's influence in Vivaldi's concerto and in Goethe's book, you will need to read my capstone.
In the House of Slaves, in Rome, in the United States, antebellum South. Now you're probably thinking, why did Brother Mateo choose to write about slavery? Isn't that something horrible? The answer is yes, it is something horrible. That's probably precisely why I chose to talk about it. Let me explain. When I was in high school in Miami, I loved to learn about the civil rights movement, about people like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, about events like Brown versus the Board of Education and the Freedom Riders. These were all people that were living in a time in the United States where African Americans could not attend the same high school as white persons, nor could they go to the same movie theater or restaurant. They could not even drink from the same water fountain. So naturally, I asked myself, if these were people were living in the 1950s and all of this was going on, when slavery had already ended in 1863, then what was slavery like? After researching and reading some books, I found out about the horrors of slavery. This led to another question. Has slavery always been like this? I researched and researched. I went further and further back in time until I reached one of the greatest civilizations to exist, ancient Rome. Here is where idea came. What if I can take these two civilizations that stand 2,000 years apart and compare the life of a slave in their respective reality? Now, of course, I couldn't talk about all of slavery. And this was probably one of the hardest parts. Because I could speak about the diet of slaves. I could speak about the treatment that they faced. I could even speak about the culture that they had. But I chose to focus on one aspect, their homes. Because it is one of the most fundamental needs of every human person. Now, I know that movements regarding race and slavery are touchy subjects today. In my capstone, I do not attempt to tackle these topics. Rather, I seek to present the realities that these slaves, these men and women, experienced. We can argue that slavery no longer exists today, but the more that we learn the history about it, less likely we are to repeat it.
Anne Frank in the Nazi Holocaust. I don't know about you, but I have studied several times the Second World War and the Nazi Holocaust. But I have doing it in my high school, also in my college, and now here in Humanities. During this semester with Father Bender, we learned that a way to study history is to place yourself in that moment. And how can we do that? So we can do that placing ourselves in one of the persons who live it. So in my custom, I did this. What about to study the Nazi Holocaust through a vivid experience of one of the victims? And Anne Frank was one of these victims. And I analyzed what happened in this historical moment through her experience. But who was her? Who was she? She was a 13-year-old girl who needed to be 2 years in hidden, escaping and trying to survive the Nazi Holocaust with her family. But after these 2 years, they were found, and they were sent to the camps, to the concentration camps. So in the first part of my custom, I asked myself why the Jewish people were persecuted. So for this, I studied and researched about the origin and roots of this type of discrimination, which was the anti-Semitism. And then in the second part, I go into the story and the vivid experience of Anne Frank, getting to know that, for example, she was born in Germany. She, being a Jewish, but also a German girl, was born in 1939, just when Hitler was running for the president, or in other words, like getting to be famous in the German country. So she was born in that context when Hitler was pushing with this ideology of anti-Semitism. So then her family needed to move to the Netherlands because of the Nazi government in 1933. But in 1940, Hitler invades Netherlands. So it's very interesting just to see the normal life of a girl who needed to suffer all of these problems just because one ideology.
The enigmatic Mona Lisa and the hunting Afghan girl. Brothers, professors, we live in a world full of images. Actually, we have one here. We have been impacted by images because images tell something. We have to listen what images tells us. When I was choosing my team Capstone, I was just thinking that I love photography and I really want to link this with something else. So I linked it with the Mona Lisa. You may think why? Because the Mona Lisa have survived two wars, have survived a French Revolution, and have survived many things, and is still there in the Louvre Museum. It's one of the most famous pieces of art. And on the other hand, you have a young girl, an Afghan girl, from the Afghan war against Soviet Union. And both images impact us. Both images, until today, have been resounding on many people. Why? Because images break walls, break frontiers. You can analyze an image without knowing the language, without knowing the context of that culture. But by seeing the image, you are drawn into it. It's a bridge that connects you to another culture, to another society. The Mona Lisa, painted in the 1500s, it's still an image that until today has an impact. And Giorgio Vasari was one of the great commenters of many images. He said when he saw the Mona Lisa that every artist must tremble at seeing her enigmatic smile and seeing her. And on the other hand, you have the Afghan girl. Just look at her. Look at her eyes. When Steve McCurry, the photographer, in 1984 went to Pakistan, to this refugee camp, she saw these girls, and she wanted to photograph a picture to let to know the world what was happening at the time of the war. So he entered to a classroom, beautiful girl with her amazing eyes. But this girl was very shy. She didn't want to take a photograph, to be photographed. So the teacher told her, Ula, please, he wants to take a picture of you because we want to let know the people in the world how do we feel, what is happening in our lives. And in a question of 2 seconds or less, she gave this look. And after, she went to play with her friends.
A comparison between two requiems. Do you as religious know what a requiem is? In what circumstances we use a requiem? What is the structure for a requiem? Or even what are the rubrics for writing a requiem? Who writes a requiem, musically speaking? All of this information is very important for us religious to know. We cannot use whatever type of music during Mass. All of these questions are very important in my capstone because I would like to try to clarify how two requiems are very similar, but just a single detail changes the entire meaning of the whole piece.
Value of digital libraries and physical libraries in today's world. Are the physical libraries going to the end? A couple of months ago, I was talking with Father Miguel. All of you know who is Father Miguel, the Dean of Studies. No? And I was talking with him and I asked him, Father, I don't know what to do with the capstone. What do you recommend me? And he told me, brother, you have been working for a year in the library. It would be a good idea to start something new with the libraries. I was thinking, wow, this is interesting, Father. Thank you. I think we should start something like that. And I went, after that meeting, I went with Mr. McSweeney, who is the librarian. And I asked him about the libraries. And for me, the topic of digital libraries came to my mind because I started to think, maybe the physical libraries are going to the end. They are gonna be obsolete because these new digital libraries have been growing a lot from the last 15 years. And doing some research, I realized, and this is the topic. I divided in my capstone in 3 different topics. The first one is the historical and importance part of physical libraries. And I started to see the historic part and all the knowledge that the libraries have been keeping in it and how they are been growing. And now, in the second part, I started to talk about digital libraries and how they, in a sense, were growing, but it was that moment that many people started to say, no, this is just the beginning of a new age, and we can say bye to the physical libraries. And in the third part, I have the conclusion, and it's the relationship between those two. And I realized that these two are together. The physical libraries have been working hard to create these digital libraries that is helping a lot of people. People that are in another countries, they don't have these libraries, physical libraries that they can go and research, but they have the internet, and they can find all the documents and everything in the computer from their home, and it's something that is helping. It's not going to the end. And it's really good to see how the society is working hard just because once that other people grow and help, and now the society can be better. And with this, we can find that new and better society. That is my capstone about.
Two wings towards truth. How faith and reason come together at the Vatican Observatory. Deum creatorem venite adoremus. Come, let us adore God the Creator. Thus is written in stone in the main building of the Vatican Observatory in Rome. A beautiful construction located at the summer house of the Pope, where he used to spend the warm month of August. But what? Are you telling me that Pope Francis spends his vacation looking through a telescope? You might be thinking. What about the numberless letters he receives every day and has not yet answered? What about the thousands of people that are willing to have a private audience with him? Prime ministers, presidents, priests, nuns, religious, you, legionaries. So let me tell you that the church is also interested in science. But why so? I asked myself while I was doing my capstone. And I found out that I needed to go back to 1891, when Pope Leo III established a rudimentary observatory on the top of the Tower of the Winds in Rome. Or even before, when Pope Gregory VIII, with the help of some Jesuit astronomers in 1582, reformed the calendar. Yes, the same calendar that you and I use today to even schedule these interesting events. So yes, the church is also the mother of science, as it used to be called. But then comes the question, should theologians observe through the telescope? Likewise, should
scientists study creation and reach God? Indeed, for faith and reason are not against each other. And as John Paul II would say, they are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth.
The genealogy of Jesus, the historical and cultural context of Abraham, Ruth, and King David. I'm sure all our live streaming audience and all of you remember our last semester dinner gala, Journey of Hope. For this event, I was interviewed, and among many questions, one stayed in my heart. The interview asked, Brother Marcelo, what do you love? What do you love? He asked again. The answer is simple, the Bible. I love the Bible. For me, and maybe some of you can relate, it was the first book that I was introduced to. It was the first social event, my baptism. And there, the Bible was read. So the Bible. As Catholics, we ought to love the Bible. And Pope Francis has spoken a lot about the Bible and the love for sacred scripture. So the question comes, okay, but we're not studying here theology, we're studying humanities. So I want to speak with Father Miguel, our Dean of Studies, and then with Dr. Mercier, who was going to help me in this amazing journey. And little by little, the answer became clearer, or the path that we were going to follow. To place Abraham, our father in faith, Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David, the Moabite Ruth, widow, King David, a man after God's own heart, to place them in their historical and cultural context. We all have heard the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1. But I wonder, what was happening while Abraham was going out of Ur de Calderas and was traveling, following a promise in Genesis 12? What was happening in Egypt, or in the beginnings of another society, while Ruth was departing and saying, your God will be my God, and your culture shall be my culture. And after a few pages later, meeting Boaz and being great-grandmother of King David. What was happening as King David was building his empire in Egypt? All of these questions in their historical and cultural context are approached in this capstone paper. So at the end, arriving to Jesus and of course the big empire of Rome, maybe you can say like the old Simeon, now you can let your servant go in peace, for Jesus is indeed the Messiah.
Freedom in Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, an analysis into characters Raskolnikov and Sonia, or in short, Freedom in Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment was first published in 1866 by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This book is considered by many the best book ever written by Dostoevsky. The work develops many themes throughout the novel that goes from alienation from society, passing through nihilism, and all the way to the idea of the Superman. And all these themes are explained in the novel and in the external sources. But there is one theme, though, that is explicit throughout the novel, but the external sources doesn't speak about it. And this theme is, of course, freedom. So I can proudly say that this is a point where my capstone brings novelty. I compare, well, first I study two characters in the novel, Raskolnikov and these two characters are surrounded by misery, both economical and moral. In these circumstances, they keep making choices and decisions that affect them and those around them. But how free can you be when you are in these circumstances, in this misery? Well, this is what my capstone tries to do and does very well. So this study two different ways of living freedom in this misery, if we can say, if there is any freedom.
Concepts of leadership in Julius Caesar. I think that all of us, we are aware of the importance of leadership and the need that we have in society of good leaders and the consequences that good leaders can give in society and the consequences of bad leaders in society. I was talking about this with one brother last year, and we were wondering, how can we develop our leadership skills? More us as legionaries, that we are called to be leaders and form other leaders. So I started to read a book about Julius Caesar, and I get amazed of the political abilities that he had and the talent that he had of influencing in others. And I was wondering if all these abilities, all these actions that Julius Caesar did 2,000 years ago, they are still valid nowadays with all these things that we are living. So I decided to read a little bit more about leadership, and that's why I wrote my capstone. I have two authors. In one side, I have Nicholas Machiavelli, that he wrote a book called The Prince, one of the most important books about politics. In this book, Nicholas Machiavelli teach a leader how he has to lead his people and his state. In the other chapter, I have an analysis and the concepts of leadership of Dale Carnegie, that he wrote a book that is the bestseller book about leadership in the last 80 years. And I compared those concepts and I applied them to Julius Caesar. Doing this research, I conclude that we can learn about leadership from the leaders of the past, and that leadership is not just something that was amazing 2,000 years ago. It's something that is universal, no matter time, no matter place. As Julius Caesar was impacted by the testimony of Alexander the Great, that was years before him, we can impact others through our own testimony, through our own leadership.
Colonial period in the United States and in Brazil. So the reason I wrote this capstone, it is because I'm a Brazilian living in US, precisely. Because once I arrived here in US, I realized that we have many similarities between the two cultures, but also many differences. And it is interesting to see that each cause has a consequence. So the main idea of this capstone is not just to talk about the differences and to say, okay, so make a comparison, but also to show that if you have a choice and you practice this choice, we have a consequence in the life. And it happened also in the colonies. So if I want to make a propaganda of my capstone, there are two reasons why you should read my capstone. The first is because it is well written by myself, I hope. And the second, it is precisely to show that we have a choice in our hands and you need to do it. And how did I do that? Well, I divide my capstone in 3 chapters. The first chapter, I present the English colony. In other words, the American colonies, the 13 colonies. And I introduce, okay, so what the background was in England before the arrival of the Europeans in these lands. And then, okay, so what the causes also was when they arrived here. So what led the English to come here and to live here. And then the activities that were practiced here in these colonies. The second chapter, it is like similar to the first chapter, but referring to Brazil. So what the background was in Portugal, what the causes were in that led the Portuguese to go to Brazil and to live there, and also the activities that were practiced there.
And the third chapter, it is the comparison. So making this comparison, I focused more on the differences rather than in the similarities, because I wanted to see, okay, so if we have many things similar, so what led us to become different cultures and countries nowadays? And the answer, it is mainly on the differences. So if I can give you some examples, the religion was one of the main causes, because as it is known, in England they were Protestant Anglicans, and at that time they were persecuting all the other religions in a way. And so all the Protestants, the Puritans as they were called, came to live here, and they saw an opportunity to have a promised land here in the West. So everything was just grace, and to let us build up a new empire of grace according to the gospel, and to cultivate the land God has given us. Another hand, in Portugal, they were Catholics, and the main idea was to evangelize. But also it is known that unfortunately the crown and the religion were two things different. So many times there was this conflict between the religion and the crown, because when the crown was trying to extract raw material, the Jesuits, they were trying to evangelize, and it brought a conflict. Also, the weather, the climate also was different, as it is known. I mean, we have experienced the non-Americans that it is a little bit more cold, so we need to produce the land, like to take advantage of the time to produce and to make grow our food. So that's why there is this idea of always building and always trying to take advantage of the last minute also. In Brazil, it is like, okay, it is warmer, we have more time to produce and to take our food, so we don't have that worry of being fed, because I mean also the weather helps us there. And I hope you can read this capstone, because you can also, I mean, take a book and read the whole book about the colonies and to see the difference of the two colonies. But I guess in my capstone it is like shorter and more summarized. So, in order for the sake of the time, I guess it is also good. And
historical influences on Pierre de Coubertin for the foundation of the modern Olympic Games. We already spoke about art, literature, music, but now I invite you to turn to another realm, the realm of sports. Because I believe that sports can also talk about the human heart. In fact, I believe that sports can be the playground of virtue. But I'm gonna ask you to try to imagine a world without sports. Could you do it? It is hard, right? Well, let us go back in time a little bit. 1896. For most common people, the word sport wouldn't even be in their dictionaries. Actually, only high society classes had a chance to practice this type of leisure activities. But now, let me tell you something. Sports are not a new thing. Actually, Greeks already practiced sports, even before Christ came to the world. But why did sports just disappear from the face of the earth through centuries and centuries? That is a good question. Yes, indeed, there's always been games all around the world, but nobody dared to formalize and establish those games for people to come and see. So, for me, all of these thoughts were interesting, and I decided to investigate a little bit more about these revivals of sports.
this refoundation of the Olympic ideal. So in my capstone, I analyze some of the topics that help to bring about this new idea, this new sporting phenomena, as we will call it today. From the time and place where Pierre de Coubertin lived in, to some thinkers that influenced his way of develop these games. All of those events are important and remarkable for the refoundation of the modern Olympic Games.
Keharitomene, God's title for Mary. The most important announcement in our whole history, in our salvation, was when an angel came to an untouched maiden and told her, Haire Keharitomene. Those two Greek words were the opening and the beginning of our salvation history. Those two Greek words were the title that God gave to Our Lady. Normally, Keharitomene, it's translated as full of grace or favored one. But if you go back to the Greek, the possibilities are numberless. Just the verb keharitomene from harito, from the root haris, that normally can mean grace, but it also can mean beauty, it can also mean pleasure, it can also mean favor, thankfulness, kindness, goodness of heart, reciprocity. So just looking at the possibilities from the root, you can find numbers and numbers and numbers of ideas of what could keharitomene mean. And then if you look at the fathers of the church, the interpreters, especially Greek speaker interpreters of the word, you find that those possibilities were actually there for the first members of the church. Some of them, for example, found a relationship between the verb harito, the verb here in keharitomene, and the second part where it appears in the New Testament in St. Paul, in Ephesians 1:6, where St. Paul uses harito, the verb, as refers to the fact of salvation. And he says that to call Mary keharitomene, full of grace, means that she is already living the fruits of resurrection. Other people mind in her soul. There are other possibilities. Normally we take it as a passive verb, but also it can be a middle, circumstantial to haire. That means hail or rejoice, among other possibilities. Looking at this, you can translate it not only as hail, full of grace, but you can say, hail, you have been full of grace. Hail because you are full of grace, or because you are beautiful, or because you are favored, or because you have been thankful, because you have received grace and you have answered and you have responded to this grace. So my capstone is an exploration through all these possibilities in this Greek word, and to look at what are the broader ideas that are enclosed in this word. And it's also the only capstone, I think, that ends with a prayer.
Abyssus abyssum invocat. Abyss language in Tauler and Nietzsche. Falling, 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 hurtling down the dark abyss, down sheer chasms of fall frightful into never-ending doom. Or so the poem goes. Right, when we hear the word abyss, perhaps many of us associate it with terror, with despair, and with darkness. However, this is far from a full understanding of the term. Johannes Tauler, a 13th century German mystic, and Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the fathers of atheistic existentialism, both point to an experience that is much more profound. Right, for both Tauler and Nietzsche, the abyss is a mystical experience that touches the depths of reality, that sees beyond the clear things of this world. Right, the abyss stands for nowhere. It's the groundless ground beyond intellect, beyond physics, beyond emotion. It is simultaneously suffering and joy, darkness and light, the annihilation of the self. Right? What if all of this is based on a lie? Right? What if my entire spiritual life is just some psycho-spiritual experience wrapped in the veneers of Christianity? It is really interesting how similar their descriptions of the abyss are. And I think that's because perhaps spiritual experiences are the highest common denominator that we believers can have with someone who rejects absolute truth, who rejects the existence of God. So if you want to stay comfortable in your Christianity, brothers, don't read my capstone. Right, so though they may seem superficially similar, right, the Nietzschean abyss and Tauler's mysticism of the abyss are profoundly different in their foundations and in their fruits. One begins in hubris and ends in despair. The other begins in humility and ends in exaltation. Nietzsche died in the abyss of madness, while countless Christian mystics have transformed society, being immersed in the abyss of divine love. Christians and non-Christians can both enter into the abyss. But who we encounter there and how we emerge make all the difference between sanctity and insanity. So I would now like to invite to the stage Dr. Charles Mercier to give the closing words.
Well, just a brief word of thanks to all of you for all of this work you did, not just this morning, but through this whole semester and these 2 years. And thank you for all the inspiration you have given to the first-year humanists who will be producing their capstones next year. It was very gratifying to see proven what Dr. Kearns so rashly claimed at the beginning of this morning, that the humanities are interconnected, but you gave a brilliant demonstration of that. And indeed, what our whole program proposes and seeks to accomplish in all of you. John Paul never tired of quoting Gaudium et Spes. The human person is the only creature God willed for his or her own sake. And I thank you that all of these projects illuminated that truth for us this morning. Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, libraries, Anne Frank, Olympic Games, perfect passive participles in Greek. Yes, or is it middle? Yes, or is it both? God reveals himself in perfect passive participles, does he not? Ancient slavery, Vivaldi, Mozart, astronomy. That list is just a metonymy for all the wonderful projects we heard this morning. I hope you all remember what metonymy is, and appreciate what a useful rhetorical technique it is at a moment like this. But I thank you all very much. It was a wonderful morning. I thank you for all these wonderful projects we heard this morning.
Well, congratulations, brothers. So second, you brothers can go and rest a little bit, refresh your mind and your mouth and everything. First, you brothers, you got a beautiful example of what you can do next year, right? And we, the professors, are going to have our meeting for the end of the semester, okay? So thank you, brothers. Have a wonderful morning.